you, Paul. It's great to be here, and I want to especially thank both Paul and Jeannie Olson, who have been good friends of mine for many years. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
We met at Holden Village, a place where I know many Augustana students and faculty have gone, and where Paul has been the teaching, teaching head, anyway, the teaching boss.
That's it.
Yeah. The big teaching cahoon for many years, and I have had the opportunity to be one of the teachers off and on there, and it's an absolutely wonderful place. I'm going to just say a few things about my life that have brought me to this, and if you were in the morning class, particularly, forgive me because I will repeat a tiny bit of that, one thing in particular, but, or if you were in some of the other classes, you'll probably see a little overlap, but hopefully not too much. I don't want to bore anybody with things that they've heard before. I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area and was introduced as a very young kid to the mountains, to backpacking, to hiking, to the world of Yosemite and Kings Canyon and Sequoia. And as a high school kid, my parents would take my friends and I up after the school year got out and simply drop us off in the mountains. And, 2 of us, 3 of us, as many as 6 of us sometimes, we would just go backpacking and hiking to our heart's content, and then one of the other kids' parents would pick us up 4 weeks later, 6 weeks later, and so forth. This made me appreciate a number of things. It made me appreciate time, because it takes time to do those kind of things and to slow down to that natural pace of nature. For me, it was a kind of freedom, a real freedom, to be able to sort of choose what you were going to do. There was a sense of responsibility, because there was a sense that you could appreciate the fact that you didn't have to have a lot of stuff to have a good time, because basically when you're backpacking, as anybody who backpacks knows, you can't carry that much. So whatever you want of the stuff, you got to have it on your back. And that's a good reason not to have too much of it. But one of the things that happened was I joined the Sierra Club. Growing up in San Francisco, where the Sierra Club was headquartered, I joined the Sierra Club when I was 14 years old, just to go on some of the hikes. And later in life, became very interested in many of the things that the Sierra Club was doing to promote national parks and wilderness and preserving and conserving areas to do the kind of things that I like to do. And particularly in the early 1960s, the Sierra Club put out a series of beautiful coffee table books about wild places in America. The first of those being a book called "This is the American Earth" by using the wonderful photography of Ansel Adams and poetry and prose by a woman named Nancy Newhall. These books inspired me. The ideas behind them inspired me. The writings of John Muir, the famous naturalist and father of, I think, of our national park system, inspired me as a kid. And so this is kind of what I was about. I had no intention to be somebody who was involved in social issues. I actually wanted to be a park ranger when I was a kid. I went to the University of California at Berkeley with the idea of doing that, of being a ranger. But other things intervened. One thing called the War in Vietnam, around which I became an activist, and the War on Poverty, which drew me in early because I always hate to confess this on a college campus, but I was anything but a good student. And I didn't flunk out, but I came close. And after my freshman year at UC Berkeley, I joined VISTA, the Domestic Peace Corps. And this was the first year of VISTA, 1965, when the first volunteers in the War on Poverty were going out to communities around the country. And VISTA sent me to an Indian reservation in northern Wisconsin on the shores of Lake Superior. This was my first introduction as a suburban California kid to the Midwest, and particularly to a very cold part of the Midwest, and in a situation where, as a VISTA volunteer, I lived like and with the people that I was serving, and in those days, no one on that reservation had running water. We did have electricity, but we lived in your proverbial wood and tar paper house. Running water meant running, especially when it was cold in winter, as fast as you could down the road to the pump and pumping the water, and it meant going out to the outhouse at night in temperatures that sometimes got down to 30 below zero. And it introduced me to another world, a world completely different from the world of my suburban upbringing. It also taught me that America was in a real sense two different societies, haves and have-nots. I saw and experienced what racism meant, and I'm very happy to say that I just went back to that reservation, to Odeno, Wisconsin, right near Ashland, last week. And I hadn't been there in 20 years. And I was here up in the upper Midwest, in Minnesota, Duluth, and so I went over to the reservation and I wanted to see if that old tarp paper house that I lived in was still there, and it wasn't. In fact, the whole town now, which was there at that time, which was built in a swamp, essentially, in a floodplain, has now been moved to higher ground, and all of what was once the town has been completely reclaimed by forest. And it's really pretty neat to see, actually, what has happened there. There are still what used to be the ball fields in the old part of town and other things are now the powwow grounds. And the folks there have become very proud of their heritage and their tradition, something which was not the case in 1965. In fact, there was not only racism from the white communities, but Indians were racist to Indians. I mean, there was a sort of negative sense about being an Indian at the time. Much of that changed in the early 1970s with the AIM movement and the Wounded Knee occupation and this sort of sense of native pride, and that exists today. And the interesting thing for me is that the tribe now, and Bad River, and you can look this up, is actually a place that is designated, the reservation is designated to be the site of, if it is opened, what would be the world's largest open pit mine. An iron mine 4.5 miles long, 1 mile wide, and 1,000 feet deep, to mine very low grade iron ore that we're now able to process. All these folks who were kids when I was working on the reservation in the 1960s are now the elders of the tribe, and they are fighting with all they can this mine, which has been pushed on them by the Wisconsin legislature, which has not only stripped all of the environmental regulations which were built there, but also has passed a law saying you can't even protest within 15 or 20 miles of the site where the mine will be. Now, the good news is most people think that the mine probably won't get built, but not for the reasons of the protesters, more because it may never be fully economically feasible. It's just a bit too costly. Nonetheless, these were things kind of come full circle, and many of the issues that I've been concerned with about the environment now are connected directly with the people that I worked with. And this is the part I did mention in the class this morning, the story I'm going to tell you. When I think about happiness, which is the subject of my talk, and my experiences in this little country called Bhutan, I think not of sort of personal pleasure, sort of hedonistic, momentary pleasure, but of having a life that is satisfied. And I think of that in terms of the person who is the hero. I think all of us have heroes in their lives. And I have two. One is Paul Olson, but the other one is a fellow named David Brower, who built the Sierra Club as an organization, who founded Friends of the Earth and Earth Island Institute, an environmental group that I am now on the board of, who helped create many national parks, who stopped dams from being built in the Grand Canyon and other places. Perhaps the most effective American environmental leader of the 20th century. I had the great honor to be able to produce the biography of his life for television in 1990 for PBS. It's called For Earth's Sake. And I really got to know him well over the last 28 years of his life. I met him initially in 1972 and knew him until he died in the year 2000. But the story that I will never forget is that about 5 days before he died, I went to visit him in the hospital with a friend. And this was a place called Alta Bates. It's a hospital in Berkeley, California, where he lived his entire life. And it was very clear that he was a very sick man. He had about his third bout with cancer. He was 88 years old, and it was pretty obvious that the end was near. And but I, am one of these people who likes to put a happy face on things. And so as we were leaving, I said, Dave, I hope that the next time I see you, you're going to be healthy again, and you're going to be out there once more fighting the good fight. And he looked me in the eye, and he said, John, I don't think that's in the cards, but it's been a great 88 years. That's, in a nutshell, what I think happiness is about. However long we have on this planet, we can come to the end and we can say it's been a great 88 years. And so Brower has taught me a lot. One of the things he taught me, and he taught many other people, is that we face urgent times where the environment is concerned right now. We don't like to talk about these things, and I certainly don't want to be a prophet of gloom and doom. I am not that at all, but I'm going to start out with a little gloom and doom, and then I'm going to try to take you back up into a situation that is a bit more optimistic. Dave Brower used to deliver what he called his sermon. He was not a particularly religious man, but in his sermon, he compressed the age of the Earth, estimated by scientists at something like 4.6 billion years, into 1 week. You could look at it as the biblical week of creation. And if you do that, you find that a day is about 650 million years, a minute is 27 million years, an hour is 27 million years, a minute 450,000, and a second 7,500 years. So just to give you an idea, if you put the Earth into 1 week. So Sunday morning, the Earth begins. Tuesday afternoon, the first life forms appear. They are very small, one-celled organisms. Over the next few days, they become larger, more specialized, more wondrous, more beautiful. And on the last day of the week, Saturday, the 7th day of the week, at about noon, these big guys show up, and big gals. They show up on the planet. They're called the dinosaurs, the great reptiles. They show up about in the middle of the last day, and they have a long time. They spend a lot of time here. They last for 4 hours. They last about 4 hours on the Earth, which is a sizable amount of time, perhaps more than that. But anyway, at about 4 in the afternoon, their life is ended when the Earth is struck by an asteroid, a big meteorite in the Gulf of Mexico. The climate is cooled, and they are gone, and then they're replaced by mammals. And at 3 minutes before midnight on the final day, human beings appear on the planet. At 1/3 of a second before midnight, last night, Buddha is born. At 1/4 of a second before midnight, Christ is born. At 1/25th of a second, approximately before midnight, the Industrial Revolution began some 250 years ago. And at 1/100th of a second before midnight, this thing we are all part of, the consumer society, begins. And we start producing and consuming lots and lots of stuff. And this is expanding very rapidly now, so that as all countries become part of this. But what Brower pointed out is, in that mere 1/100th of a second, a blink in the geological eye, we have used more resources than all human beings who ever lived in all of time, all put together before that time. Think of that. We have reduced our soils, our fisheries, our fossil fuels, and many other resources by at least half. We have caused the extinction of countless species, and we are dramatically changing the climate. So just think again what it means that we've done this in this infinitesimal period of time. And then Brower said, now there are people, important people. They run our corporations. They run our government. They sometimes even run our universities. They are considered intelligent, reasonable, normal people. They believe that what we have been doing for this last 1/100th of a second can go on indefinitely. But they are stark, raving, mad. We can't go on like this. It's not there. If everybody in the world were to suddenly consume at the American level, we would need 5 planets to provide for the resources and to absorb the wastes. So we're 4 planets short. We don't really have it. Now we have got to change, we have got to gradually find a way, not overnight, it's not cold turkey, but we need to find a way to live better with less stuff, but with more of what matters in life. And that has been my message for a long time, that in fact, this is not about gloom and doom. This is not really about sacrifice. That this way of life is not satisfying, and we can have one in which we consume less, in which we are better stewards of the planet, and in which we are also happier. So my work has been involved in both looking at these issues of overconsumption, that's what affluenza was about, and of time, of how much we work, particularly as Americans, in order to produce all this stuff, and how much stress, and how serious all of this affects our health, for example, and our connection with other human beings, how lonely it ultimately makes us. And so I've worked on those issues, particularly on the time issue, and worked on various things like trying to win more vacation time for Americans, for example. And all of that led to my being invited in 2009 to speak as a so-called expert on the issue of work-life balance, which, as Paul has pointed out to me, I'm not so good at when it comes down to it. I was asked to speak on this at an International Gross National Happiness Conference in Brazil. And I hadn't heard too much about this sort of thing. In fact, it even sounded kind of funny to me, what's gross national happiness. But when I got there, I discovered, and I met a lot of people from this little country of Bhutan. And I was asked again to speak in Brazil last fall, in 2011, at another happiness conference. And at that point, I spoke with one of the leaders of the movement in Bhutan, who invited me to come this past January to be an advisor to Bhutan's government for a major project that they were doing for the United Nations. So I had the opportunity to travel to this little country tucked between China and India in January and February of this year, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that. And I've normally said in talks that I believe that power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. But I'm going to use a PowerPoint here just to show you a little bit. It is not an academic PowerPoint, and it may seem a bit simplistic. It's more of a travelogue, but hopefully I will also convey some ideas at the same time. So Bhutan, this is gross national happiness is officially the purpose of Bhutan's government. It is enshrined in its constitution. Article 9.2 says that the goal of our government is to increase the gross national happiness of our people. It's sort of a joke, and we'll get to that in a bit, but they do take this quite seriously. So this is a country that has 750 million people. It is the only nation on earth without a stoplight. They had 3. The people didn't like them, so they took them out. I didn't even see any stop signs. People just have to slow down. There aren't a lot of cars, but they're getting more cars. 70% of the land in the country is covered by forests, and in fact the laws in Bhutan say that the country must remain in perpetuity in 60% with 60% forest cover for the sake of sustainability. So they can still do some cutting, but they have to keep it that way. And those forests provide some very valuable things. They control flooding, they improve lives of people in many ways. They understand that these forests are worth a lot to them even without being cut down. This is one of the lessons, I think, of the new science of ecological economics. Bhutan is either the only or one of very few countries in the world that are actually carbon negative. What that means is that they actually sequester more greenhouse gases, more CO2, than they emit. By contrast, the United States produces about 25% of all the carbon emissions, CO2 emissions. But just because Bhutan doesn't produce any carbon doesn't mean Bhutan is doing good from climate change. In fact, quite the opposite. This little country is seeing its big glaciers and those 24,000-foot Himalayan peaks in the northern part of the country along the Chinese border melting at an incredibly rapid rate and causing a great deal of flooding all throughout the country as the lakes at the base of the glaciers, the dams, the moraines from those lakes burst with the amount of water coming out of the glaciers, and these great floods come downstream. So they're very worried because climate change is affecting them, just like a country like Bangladesh, which also produces almost no carbon output, but is seeing enormous amounts of flooding and other things caused by what we do, what we produce. Bhutan is a beautiful place. Oh, maybe we should get the lights down. When I've got this.
If somebody knows how to do it. You said it was okay for your...
Can you see okay the slides? It looks like it's a little hard.
You know, sure.
I don't, but I'll play around. I don't know, but I'll play around.
I don't think it's any of those switches, John.
Pardon?
I don't think it's those switches. I think it's inside here.
Oh, maybe. Is magic going to happen? Sharon, do you know?
I don't, but I've seen people go in here and the lights come out.
All right, well, we'll just take it. Well, we're having the opposite effect, so that must mean that we can. All right.
Is that okay?
Yeah, maybe even if it's like, they could probably be on a little bit more. Yeah, is that good? Okay, cool. Wow. Ooh. So Bhutan is a beautiful place. It was, it said that this was the model for the mystical kingdom of Shangri-La, which is the magical place in a 1933 novel called Lost Horizon. that I just read recently. I never read it before, and it's actually quite a fascinating story. Many Americans were familiar with it because it was also a popular Hollywood film in the 30s and 40s. But you have these high peaks, 24,000 foot, the world's highest unclimbed mountains, and then you have these sort of impossibly green and beautiful valleys with all kinds of crops and so forth. Land is all up and down. There's only one place for an airport that can land jet planes that's flat enough to do that, and it's about an hour and a half from the capital, a place called Paro. You can see a little bit. The national sport is archery. The architecture has inspired people over many years. It's sort of a combination of Swiss chalets and Japanese pagodas and all kinds of things. So it's I want to tell a funny little story, which I told to some folks earlier. This inspired 100 years ago. There was an article in National Geographic in 1914 called Castles in the Air. This article had a lot of black and white photos of Bhutanese architecture with these mountains behind, which you couldn't tell how green they were. You had no idea. And a woman in Texas read this article, and she was about to bequeath a large fortune to the Texas School of Mines, which is in El Paso, and which is now called the University of Texas at El Paso. And it's kind of fun. I think it was Lendell Calder, a professor here who recently went down there, and he said, "Do you know about this?" And I said, "Yeah, actually I do." So if you Google Bhutan on the border, what you'll see is that the University of Texas at El Paso is Bhutan on the border. All of the architecture, all the campus buildings, even the ATM machines look like little Buddhist shrines and like this kind of stuff. The whole campus, because this woman gave this school all this money, and she said, "Well, you can have it, but the buildings have to all look like this. And it has to be like this basically forever." So Texas El Paso has a few buildings. They have a LEED certified, science, environmental science center and things, but almost everything is like this. And they have a great exchange program with Bhutan. Students go back and forth. So who'd have thunk? But Texas El Paso, Bhutan on the border. So in 1972, the king of Bhutan, then 16 years old, this fellow Jigme Singye Wangchuck, he was crowned king when he was 16, when his father died. And the story goes that either when he was crowned or shortly thereafter, he was asked by a reporter from Australia, "So king, what are you going to do to increase your country's gross national product?" Because it's pretty small, and that's how we measure success in the Western world. Growth of the, we then called the GNP, we now call the GDP. And the king paused for a moment, and he said, "Well, excuse me, sir, but I think that gross national happiness is more important than gross national product." Now, we would have kind of laughed at a statement like that, considered it rather funny, or yawned and gone back to the business of making money, or gotten the folks to come with the white coats. But the king, people in Bhutan take the king seriously, and so for 40 years, Bhutan has been trying to figure out what makes people happy and how government policy can actually contribute to their happiness. So Bhutan measures, they brought all these scientists from different disciplines there, psychologists, behavior, people studying the brain, all kinds of people to tell them what sorts of activities, what sorts of conditions make people happy. Novel idea, but what they were told was that these were all key domains, key areas that you have to pay attention to if you want people to be happy. So material well-being, that's stuff. That's, income. That's what we sort of look at exclusively. That's one of them, but it's only one of the 9. And what happiness science has found is that up to a particular point, when people are very poor, getting more money goes a long way to make them happier. But after they reach a certain level of modest comfort, being richer and richer doesn't really contribute much to increased happiness. So what else does contribute to happiness? Well, physical health, certainly an important thing. Mental health or psychological well-being, and we have much of the impact on our happiness in the U.S. comes from the number of people who are suffering from mental illness, from anxiety, from depression, from all of those kinds of things. The environment, and this is especially access to nature, to green space. We know this is important for happiness and for well-being, and people who are deprived of this, or people who live in very polluted conditions, that contributes to their unhappiness. Most important one of all probably is social connection, what we refer to here as community vitality. It means having support from friends and from family. It means participating and being a part of the community. It's what Abraham Maslow, the psychologist, called the belongingness needs. If you've seen his pyramid, hierarchy of needs pyramid, that starts with the physiological stuff and goes up to health and safety, and then belongingness, connection. So we know that social connection is hugely important, not only for happiness, but for health and so forth. Culture of vitality, very important to the Bhutanese because they were afraid that they were losing their culture to the sort of onslaught of Western materialism and cultural values. Bhutan, interestingly enough, is the last country in the world to have gotten television. Bhutan did not introduce television until 1999. Imagine that. That's when the first TV sets and the first TV programs were shown in Bhutan. Bhutan is a laboratory for the effects of television. And one of the things that it has shown us and shown the Bhutanese is that when you get a lot of violent TV, it does influence people's behavior. And Bhutan got a lot of it from India and other places. In fact, one of the most popular TV programs early on in Bhutan was Worldwide Wrestling. And this is not like a bloody, violent show or anything, but it's sort of an aggressive thing. And what the Bhutanese found was that they had a big uptick in domestic abuse and things resulting from the introduction of television. So they've tried to limit it in some ways, but it's still an issue. They have tried to get people to preserve aspects of culture. And you can see them, in Bhutan, you walk down the street and you see everybody's got a smartphone. They're cheap ones. They're the ones we discard. They get sold there. People are wearing Nike shirts and all of those kinds of things. And kids think it's very hip to have all the American fashions and so forth. So the country is concerned about the impact of this. Government. Bhutan found that having a democratic government in which people really participate and are engaged, is free from corruption, is transparent, is not driven by money, and so forth, is an important part of people's overall sense of life satisfaction and happiness. And when the king found that out, as I'll tell you, he decided to make Bhutan a democracy and not a monarchy. And so he turned it into a republic. Now here's the one I'm interested in from my work, and this is time balance. And the Bhutanese have discovered that having balance between work and leisure and not living a life that is full of pressure, of overwork, of stress, of all of these kind of things is very, very important for people's sense of life satisfaction. And then finally, education. By this I mean not only formal education like college, but lifelong learning and the things that it contributes to actually be curious, to learn about the world, to learn things. It actually allows us to be much happier, much more interested and excited, even with less stuff to entertain us, so that's an important thing. So the king found out that democracy was important. He turned over the throne to his young son, who was at that time about 29 years old, and made Bhutan a democratic republic. They had their first parliamentary elections in 2008 and just had their second set of parliamentary elections this summer. Now, Bhutan is doing a measurement every 2 years of how happy the population is. They do a survey. They actually take surveys out to these villages, and they ask people lots and lots of questions about their lives and about aspects of these 9 domains of well-being. And they analyze this survey. It's very complex how they do it, so I'm not going to go into that. But they then look and see how well are we doing in each of these areas of life. And then they make policy based on how they think the laws that are proposed will affect all of these aspects of life. They have a tool, a policy tool, in which they score all potential legislation based on will it improve health or make it worse or be the same? Will it improve education or make it? Everything has to be checked in terms of how it will affect all of these aspects of life, not just the one that it's intended to. And they have a gross national happiness commission, believe it or not, 24 people who have expertise in these areas who actually make that analysis. And not so long ago, they decided not to join the World Trade Organization because they subjected that decision to this policy analysis and this policy tool. So Bhutan has recently taken its message to the rest of the world and understands, at least the previous government understood, that it could not just talk about this stuff internally. It is too small. It has to carry its message to the outside world if it's to be able to do anything. In July of 2011, Bhutan introduced a resolution in the United Nations saying that all member nations of the UN should make the pursuit of happiness their goal and should take steps to figure out how to measure how well they're doing. This declaration passed unanimously, and so it is actually official policy. Even the United States voted for it. But of course it doesn't mean too much. But Ban Ki-moon, the head of the UN, asked Bhutan to do some work to try to figure out how it could be taken a little bit more seriously. So on April 2nd of last year, there was a big meeting in the UN with 800 people representing most of the countries of the world. I had the opportunity to be at that meeting, and that was a beginning to move in that direction. And we ended up creating 4 working groups, one on well-being and happiness, that's the group I ultimately became part of, one on environment and sustainability, one on equality, we call fair distribution, and then a communications committee to get that message out to the world. And we planned this January-February meeting in Bhutan, which originally I thought I couldn't go to, but it ended up that I could. So this is the group of 45 of us who went to Bhutan representing many countries, and this includes people like the ministers of labor of Italy and Brazil, the head of the European Environment Agency, members of the European Parliament, famous scientists. Back there in the back, you can see the king and queen, and next to them, the prime minister of Bhutan. We had the opportunity of spending 4 days with the prime minister and the cabinet in conversations about all of this, and developed a report for the United Nations. And this is our smaller working group on well-being and happiness. And the fellow with the cap on, the older man with the cap on, is Brazil's Minister of Labor. A very fascinating guy, Paul Singer. This was, I really felt like a kind of a dodo in this group, but it was great. The fellow in the middle here is the Prime Minister. The fellow on the left, on this side here, is from China. The guy next to him is from Russia. The guy next to him is from Mexico. And I don't know about that guy on the right end. He's probably from the moon. But anyway, we had the chance while we were in Bhutan to meet for quite a long period of time with the king and queen. And this was a very fun experience for me. The king is, I had been told that the king really liked, both the king and queen really liked to play basketball. And they are tall for Bhutanese. The king's a little over 6 feet, and the queen is about 5'7". And most Bhutanese are quite small people. And when we first met the king, we were in a small group, and the king made a joke. And I thought that was setting the thing so I could be informal in conversation with him. So I said, well, Your Majesty, I said, I hear you're quite the basketball player. And they all said he played basketball. He said, well, I try, you know, but he says, you know, I'm supposed to like archery because that's our national sport, but I've never been any good at that. But what I really like is basketball, and so does my wife, the queen. She was the captain of her college basketball team. And I said then, well, I'm from the United States, and our president really likes to play basketball too. And the king said, oh, I know that. He says, you know, I understand that he's very competitive and he uses his elbows a lot. And he said, you know, what I'd really like to do is to play a game of basketball with President Obama. So we're trying to make that happen. I promised the king that I would go back and see what I could do along those lines. And this was one little thing. And actually, to tell you the story, a little while later, I was engaged in actually a private conversation with the Prime Minister. And the king wandered up to me and he said, were you serious? Because I really like this. So, you know, I never met a king before, but it was quite a fun experience. Very informal guy, looks a little bit like Elvis. So the next steps are carrying this work. You can see the more ornate artwork and stuff here in Bhutan's parliament building, carrying this to the UN. But while we were in Bhutan, we had a lot of arguments. And the arguments primarily consisted of two things. One was, some people said, well, it's all about changing policy. It's all about changing conditions of life. And other people said, no, it's all about changing human behavior and personal behavior and attitudes. So this kind of personal versus political debate. And the second debate was between people who said, we hate the term happiness. A lot of academics, I find, and policy people, they cringe when they hear the term happiness. It gives them the creeps. They think it's really a silly kind of amorphous word, and they prefer the word well-being. There's some other people, on the other hand, who think that well-being sounds like a very academic and wonky and boring word, and they like the word happiness. And so the current Minister of Labor of Italy, Enrico Giovannini, who's a really bright and wonderful guy, actually finally said to us, we're bickering over stuff we don't need to bicker about because everybody's right here, we just have to see the big picture. And we were out in a group of tents where lunch was served outside while we were in our meetings, and Enrico picked up a big stick, and in the sand in front of all of us, he drew this diagram, which is the basis, in fact, for Bhutan's proposal to the United Nations. And to make it really simple, the development paradigm, the way our economy works, the way our society works, is through many things: economy, cultural institutions, educational institutions, and so forth. It takes resources, which we refer to here as forms of capital, and it uses them to meet human needs. That can be in any kind of way. But then the question is, how do you assess how well it's doing in terms of meeting those needs? And what Enrico said is that we have to understand the word well-being as meaning those conditions of life along the domains that I mentioned that we can measure using objective data. So for health, for example, well-being is life expectancy and infant mortality and obesity and chronic illness and so forth. You can do that for each of these domains. He said happiness, on the other hand, is a subjective emotion. It's how do we feel about these relative conditions of our life. So for health, it's how do you think? Do you feel like your health is excellent or good? Do you feel that you're frequently in pain? Do you feel like you have good enough health to do the things that you need to do, and so forth? And we measure them differently. We measure well-being through data that we know about objective conditions, and we measure happiness through surveys in which we ask people, essentially, how do you feel about these aspects of their lives. Now, you can have good well-being, that is, you can have good health, and plenty of leisure time, all of these things, and still not be particularly happy. For example, supposing you have enough time off so that your life is not crazy and you don't work all the time. I use this example because this is what I'm familiar with. But you spend all of that new leisure time watching TV. The odds are that you are not going to be made happier by this change in your condition if that's what you do with it. If, on the other hand, science shows us you use that time to connect with friends and family and people, to get out into nature, to volunteer, to do things that are meaningful to you, you're very likely to see an improvement in your happiness. So the things that are in between are things we can, this is what I'm talking about here. Happiness is then well-being plus these skills, and here are examples of happiness skills. Happiness skills are about the personal side. Well-being is about the policy side, what governments can do, what policy can do. But happiness skills are things we can learn through education, and Bhutan has what it calls GNH, or Gross National Happiness Education, to teach people things like these. Compassion. These are things we know from faith traditions, all of our faith and wisdom traditions. We know them also from positive psychology and from modern neuroscience. All of the findings of modern neuroscience and positive psychology confirm our great religious traditions. It is better to give than to receive, for example. This is not just Christianity, this is modern science. We know this, we have a lot of studies. So these are some of the kinds of things: generosity, mindfulness, slowing down, tolerance, sociability, connecting with other people, gratitude for what one has. Things like delayed gratification, patience. And we can look at all of these domains and we can say, what are the happiness skills that on top of good conditions of life can make people happy? And so these are some examples for well-being, for happiness. And one of the things that we are now trying to do is to measure happiness in the United States. And we're doing this with a project called the Happiness Initiative, and this is my main message. I would like Augustana and every college in America to do a happiness initiative. And I think got Knox interested in doing it yesterday. What is a happiness initiative? Well, you can go to this website, happycounts.org, and see about it. What it means is that there's on that website a survey that takes about 15 minutes to complete, and it asks you questions in all of these domains of life that have been identified as important by Bhutan, plus one more that the Gallup organization has identified as important, and that is work satisfaction. How do you feel about your job? Do you feel productive? Do you feel like you have control? Do you feel treated fairly by your supervisors? Do you feel fairly compensated? Questions like this. And so you can take this survey and you can, I say, go out and do it. And you can do it again later as part of a campus thing, but try it out. And what you will get at the end of this survey is a personal score in each of these areas of life and a comparison to the national U.S. average, now based on about 30,000 people who have completed the survey. And when a university does this, what they do is they form a team created from various disciplines who may have knowledge and information around each of these domains we've talked about. They publicize the survey on campus using campus media. They encourage as many students, as many faculty as possible to take the survey with a URL that's specially for the campus. So it would be something like happytowns.org/Augustana, and it might be then /students/staff/faculty and so forth. People spend about 2 months just taking the survey, and then we as an organization, the Happiness Initiative, give you the full aggregate results for your campus, and you can look at those, and they can engage the school in conversation about just exactly how are we doing and what might we want to change, what might we want to make better. You publicize the results, you do activities. One of the things we're encouraging is the celebration of Pursuit of Happiness Day on April 13th each year, which just happens to be the birthday of Thomas Jefferson, who of course penned those words in our Declaration of Independence. So you can release survey results, you can have conversations about it, and you can do fun things on Happiness Day. After all, it shouldn't be gloomy, it should be lots of fun. So this is the final goal, what we call equitable and sustainable well-being and happiness. Let me show you, let me go to, for just a second here, to the Happy Count site. I'm just about done, and I want to open this up to your questions, comments, and anything that comes to mind. Always nice to have these things that work. I mean, technology, I'm a kind of an idiot when it comes to technology, so it's really nice to have technology that works. So this is, what you're seeing here is the national scores for the United States based on the some 30,000 people who have taken the happiness survey. Young people between the ages of 25 and 29 are now the least happy part of the American population. That never used to be true. It was always middle-aged people who were the least happy part of the population. But if you look here, compared by age, now you can see that it's down here. Not so big a difference, of course, but let's go back. And what you see here is the differences in how well people feel they're doing in each of these domains. And so you see overall satisfaction, a score of 66 out of 100 or 6.6 on a scale of 10. Pretty good on material well-being. People feel like they have enough stuff, although many people feel insecure about their finances. Government is low. It's probably much lower right now. I think if we looked at the survey results in the last 2 weeks, they'd be lower yet. And you see the other scores, low scores, community vitality, connection, and that's hugely important. Very few people, believe it or not, ever volunteer. We think of a lot of people volunteering, but in our survey results, only about 30% of Americans say they volunteer even one time in a year. So it's pretty amazing. But then you can see, second from the right here, the lowest score of all, very consistently in all groups in the United States except senior citizens, the lowest score is in time balance. And so that's been something that's interested me. So I think this is a fun process. I hope somebody will, Augie will take this up, contact me. My email address, if you're interested in this, is jodg@comcast.net, or see me afterwards and we can set you up with a URL and everything, and you can have fun with this on campus. So I I think that's really my major message. I would like now to take your questions and comments for a little bit. We can go into any area of this that you like. I do want to say something about sustainability, which I was supposed to say something about, and that is that we know that most of the things that are key for happiness are not necessarily material things. They don't necessarily require a lot of stuff. And there are some great studies out now, particularly by the Environmental Protection Agency of Sweden, which is working very hard on this, and I'm actually working with some Swedish scientists on these studies that are finding that people who work less have far lower environmental impacts, greenhouse gas emissions, and all of this. And they actually have, for the most part, greater life satisfaction. And one of the things that's particularly interesting is that people who work 30 hours a week are as satisfied with their finances as people who work 50 hours a week, even though the people who work 50 hours a week make more than twice as much income as the people who work 30. Now, people who work 40 hours are slightly more satisfied with their financial situation than the 30-hour folks or the 50-hour folks. But one of the things we find is that there is not this strong correlation between income and how good you actually feel about your finances or your life. One of the reasons for that is that people who work long hours to make a lot of money, who are motivated by money, the happiness science shows that they're less likely in the long run to be happy because they never get enough. If money is your motivation rather than service, you can absolutely be rich and happy. But usually because you got rich because you were doing something else. You were doing something because you cared about it. You followed your bliss. It was interesting to you. It was a service. You got to use your skills. You contributed. And you lucked out financially as well. But if your goal in life is simply to be rich, all the research shows you're less likely to be happy in the long run, even if you make a lot of money. You will always compare yourself to somebody who makes more than you do. So, can we have the lights back on?
Try.
Good luck here. So anyway, let's have at it. Questions, comments, and feel free to disagree, or let me know if there's anything stands out. There's a few more things I want to say, but I can certainly say them, I'm sure, in answer to questions. Yes?
What is the healthcare system like in Bhutan, and how do people talk about mental health and all of this?
Okay, that's a good question. What is the healthcare system like and mental health? There isn't a lot of mental illness in Bhutan, although Bhutan does have a problem with alcoholism, no question. I did find from experience there that most people definitely seem to be happy drunks, but they drink. A lot of people drink a lot. Drinking is part of, Bhutanese are very social, and part of their life is to just spend a lot of time with friends in these kind of settings where a great deal of alcohol often flows. It's a rice wine called ara, which is very cheap. I was invited to several dinner parties in which I was really one of one or two foreigners, and the rest of the folks there were Bhutanese. I was invited to these parties by the Commissioner of Happiness, and these were members and staff of the Gross National Happiness Commission having these parties, and they drank a lot. And I remember the guy coming around with the bottle of rice wine and little cups, and I would have drunk, and I'd put my hand over mine, because I didn't want to drink anymore. And he would look at me and smile and politely take my hand, lift it off, put it here, fill the cup, take my hand back, over the cup, smile, and move on. But this is an issue. But mental health, generally not bad. although alcohol does cause physical health problems. And on the other hand, the healthcare system, it's poor. There aren't a lot of doctors in the country, as you might expect. Some medicines are hard to come by, but it is absolutely and totally free for everybody. It's a universal healthcare system, like in England or Canada or someplace. And Bhutan has had free and universal healthcare since the 1980s. Same thing with education, free through college. And if you can pass the test, and if you can get yourself into, Bhutan does not have any colleges that go beyond bachelor's degrees. You can only get a bachelor's degree in Bhutan. But if you do well and you can gain admission into a university outside of Bhutan to go and study for a master's or whatever, then Bhutan's government will pay for that. And so kids go to Australia and places like that, and then they come back. Almost all the public officials and people I met had master's degrees from England or Australia, sometimes even the United States. Yes?
How does the
Sorry, can you hear me?
existence of a monarch in a democracy work?
Like in England or Holland or places like that, the king is a figurehead. He has more influence, I would say, in Bhutan than in some of those other countries, because the people there's still a lot of reverence for the king. Bhutan has a tradition of kings who have been seen sort of as servant kings, trying to live out their Buddhist values. So the kings do not live ostentatiously. They try to get out with the people. The new king, the one I met, when he was coronated, he spent 49 days right after that trekking with a backpack by foot and by bicycle to remote villages all over the Himalayan area of Bhutan, meeting with people and talking about gross national happiness. And so, you know, people think of the king as somebody that they can talk to who's really, but the power rests with the parliament. The king does have gets to actually appoint 5 members of the 55-member parliament. And those people are normally chosen to be above politics. They're normally chosen because they are seen as a particularly wise person or educated person or a monk or something of that sort. But, you know, that's about as much as I know about it. But I certainly got the feeling that people very much love the king. And you had a question?
Go ahead.
Okay, Jean, you're next. Go ahead.
Well, I've seen several surveys that said that the Danes are the happiest people in the world, and I think Sweden's up there, and Norway, and Iceland or something. What have you learned from studying those countries to apply to this?
Aha. Okay. Well, I didn't hire Jean to ask me this question, but I really like to answer this because I think it's something we Americans should think about. Gallup does several polls about happiness, very good surveys. The one problem with them is that a lot of the data is proprietary. You can't get access to it. And so we like our survey because 2 things. You can take it, you can see your results and see how you're doing, and we can share all of that. But Gallup does great polling work. And so Gallup polls 1,000 Americans every day to ask them how happy they are at different times of the day. And it comes up with an overall score very similar to ours. There's usually it's only been about a point or 2 difference between the Gallup poll results out of 100 and ours on that basic question about life satisfaction. But get this, Gallup finds that Americans are 20% happier on weekends than on work days. They are 30% happier on holidays and vacation days than they are on work days. So that tells us a little something about the value of time to people. Gallup also surveys 1,000 to 3,000 people each year, not every day, but each year, in 150 other countries. It seems like about every country in the world with 1 million people or more is part of the Gallup survey. Gallup does not survey Bhutan, but surveys using the Gallup questions have been done for Bhutan, so we know how Bhutan scores in that. Gene, you're right. Consistently, the #1 country in the world ranking for happiness is Denmark. The Danes score about 7.8 out of 10, or 78 out of 100 in the Gallup happiness survey. The country with the lowest score in the world is Togo in sub-Saharan Africa, which scores 2.9. So you can see how big the gap is. The world happiness average is 5.1 or 5.2, closer to 5.2. And the United States currently, according to Gallup, stands at 7.0. The highest countries in the world, according to Gallup, highest scores are, as you mentioned, they are the Nordic countries plus the Netherlands and Switzerland, Canada, and Australia. But the top 5 are Denmark, Norway, Finland, the Netherlands, and Sweden. Those are the top 5 scoring countries according to the Gallup poll. The U.S. ranks 17th now, according to Gallup, and we are down from being ranked 11th 5 years ago. So we've seen some decline in this period of recession. And the countries that are seeing the biggest increases in happiness over the last 5 years have been some of the African countries like Angola, where countries have become somewhat more stable and more secure, and where income is rising in countries that were very poor. The Latin American countries have seen very positive trends in happiness over the past 5 years. So have the countries of the former Soviet Union, which had a big decline for a number of years after the change there. Who's doing worse? Well, any guesses what countries have dropped the most in the last 5 years in happiness? Anybody want to venture a guess? What country might be really a lot less happy than they were 5 years ago?
Japan.
Pardon?
Japan.
Japan is about the same. They haven't had any significant change, and they're in the mid-6s in their score. It's also, one thing we also know is that based on a sort of objective conditions, when you compare those with happiness, Asians tend to score a little bit lower than we would expect given their, and Latin Americans somewhat higher than we would expect given their objective conditions of life. But no, it's not Japan. No, think of countries where life has really gotten.
Probably the Middle East.
The Middle East, absolutely. Egypt has seen the biggest decline in happiness of any country in the world. Places like Libya, Tunisia, all these places not far behind. Arab Spring, unfortunately, has not produced a happier population. The other place, of course, is Southern Europe, Greece. Big drop in Greece, and big drops in Spain and Italy and so forth. The Northern European countries have remained fairly steady, slight drops, and the U.S. has seen a drop of about 0.3 of a point in a 10-point scale. But I want to say that there are some things that the world's happiest countries have in common in answer to your question, and they aren't what a lot of political people, in fact, they aren't what a lot of Americans, I think, would like to hear. But I'm going to tell you, and you can argue with them, but I think the evidence is pretty clear. The one thing that all of the happiest countries in the world have in common is that they are among the most egalitarian countries in the world. They have the smallest gaps between rich and poor. Sweden, in fact, has the smallest gap between rich and poor, but the Danes and the Norwegians and the Dutch aren't far behind. They are also countries that have very strong social safety nets. They really have strong social welfare programs. They are, in the words of American conservatives, they are nanny states. They take care of people. They also have the world's shortest working hours. And this is particularly true of the great slackers of the world, which happen to be the Norwegians and the Dutch. And I think there's a lot of Norwegians here, so maybe you can kind of follow. Maybe there's something genetic about this.
Always one of those slackers.
Yeah, anyway, Norway has, Norway and the Netherlands have the world's shortest working hours, and Denmark and Finland and Sweden and so forth, again, are not too far behind. And finally, the other thing that these countries have in common, and the thing that I think Americans find it hardest to hear, is that these are the countries that pay the world's highest taxes. Absolutely. Denmark, in fact, has the highest tax rate in the world, and it is the #1 ranked country in happiness in the world. And again, the other countries not far behind. Now, one thing to really consider, and I think this is hugely important, because we don't do so badly in the United States in happiness. 17th isn't bad, 7.0 is not bad. But what about the generations that are coming up? And here's where I want you to think about something. Let me see if I can find this, because I think it's very, very, very valuable. I can't type either. Okay, so this is the recent study that came out this April, major study by the United Nations Children's Organization, UNICEF, comparing 29 of the world's richest countries in the welfare of children. And you can see the whole study here, but I won't go into that. But here you can see the report here from AP. According to UNICEF, #1 nation in the welfare of children in the world is the Netherlands. The way this works is that the researchers look at 5 key areas of life for children in these countries. They look at material well-being for the kids. What is the rate of poverty? Basically, the kids.
If you've experienced these abnormalities, diagnosed today.
It's on the website.
It's on the website. Really? This is just like a news article. Okay. Behave yourself. All right, so they look at child poverty, material well-being. They look at education, not only test scores and such, but years in school, graduation rates, and so forth. They look at risky behaviors, smoking, drinking, drug abuse, safety conditions for kids. They look at health. Everything obviously from obesity to, overall health of the kids, mental health of the kids. And they look at environment and housing conditions, amount of air pollution, amount of asthma, these kind of things caused from environmental factors. Those 5 categories. And then the 6th category they look at is a subjective category. They actually ask kids how satisfied they are with their lives. They start, this is not all kids, they do this for kids 12 to 17. How happy are you? Now the interesting thing is that, as it says here, the United States, one of the world's richest countries, ranks near the bottom among affluent nations in children's well-being, a United Nations report says. The report ranked 29 countries. The Netherlands was the leader, here again, followed by 4 Scandinavian countries, Norway, Iceland, Finland, and Sweden. The United States was in 26th place out of 29 countries, followed only by Lithuania, Latvia, and Romania. This is pretty interesting. There does not appear to be a strong relationship between per capita GDP, money, and overall child well-being. Country wealth does not mean happier and healthier children. And then it says, while all countries in the top 10 are Western European nations, Italy and Greece were near the bottom at 22 and 25. Britain ranked 16th and Canada 17th. We didn't even, this story, hugely important when you consider what this means for our future and how we're taking care of our kids in this land that prides itself on family values, did not even appear in the newspapers for the most part in the United States. In Canada, by contrast, Canada ranked 17th out of 29 nations. It was the front page headline story in every major Canadian daily when it came out. The Canadians were appalled to see the result. 6 years earlier, when a previous version of this was done, and the Netherlands was also #1, Britain ranked next to the bottom, the UK. And believe me, this created an enormous firestorm of anger and self-loathing and recriminations and things in England, including the Parliament. And they said, we are going to do something about this. This is absolutely embarrassing that we are doing so badly in the welfare of children. And they've done quite a lot, because you see that Britain has come up now to 16. So it's still a little below the median, but that's a huge improvement for a country because they actually focused on this. The real question, though, is this one. The Dutch kids. What am I doing? Go back to Google here. Dutch kids score #1 in 3 of the 5 objective areas, and they score #1 in their subjective happiness. In fact, Holland in this is far ahead of other countries. And so this question is now asked around the world, not here, but around the world. Why are Dutch kids so happy? And you can see this, BBC News, Europe. Why are Dutch children so happy? Going Dutch, why Dutch kids are the happiest in the world. Why are Dutch children in the world happiest? Dutch teens are the happiest in Europe. Making children happy the Dutch way. And one of the things we find is that they are happy because their parents have time for them. And the reason their parents have time for them is that they work the shortest hours. In fact, it is very typical, if you are parents with children in the Netherlands who are of school age, that one parent works, and it's normally the male. There's gender biases still, which the Dutch need to work on, but one parent works 4 days a week and the other parent works 3 days a week. They call this the 1.5 jobs policy in the Netherlands. And you are allowed to do this. If you're working a 5-day week, you can go to your employer and say, I want to work 3 days or 4 days. Instead, parents do this. Employers are required, except under special circumstances, to grant this request. And you, of course, make less money, and your benefits are prorated. But you don't lose your job, you don't lose your health care. You can do this, and Dutch parents do it. And they now have the highest percentage of people who are working part-time in the world. It is simply very common to have parents working part-time. Dutch parents are the most satisfied parents in the world because they are the least stressed for time and pressure, and stress rubs off on kids. So kids of stressed parents are stressed kids, kids of unhappy parents are happy kids. So I think there's a lot we can learn from all of this happiness research and realize that, in fact, we need to make some big changes in the United States if we want ourselves to be happy, if we want our children to be happy. And one place I would say to start is to on campuses, we're working with cities and communities around the country doing these happiness initiatives. I just was spoke in Duluth, Minnesota to the city council last week. They're going to do a citywide happiness initiative using a survey. I'm speaking in Burnsville, Minnesota to the city council on Monday. Eau Claire, Wisconsin has done a very big city happiness initiative. Over 3,000 people out of 60,000 in Eau Claire took the survey. That's a pretty good representation, and they have used it. They've really formed a team. We're working with Santa Fe, New Mexico, Nevada City, California. Decorah, Iowa was one of the first communities to do this. So anyway, I hope you'll think about this here. When I wait too long, any more questions? Where are we on time?
Last 5 minutes.
I know we have students.
Yeah, okay, so we have maybe 5 minutes left here, so any final questions or comments? Yes?
Yeah, well, I was wondering about Bhutan mostly, but about other countries that have a high happiness quotient. Do they try to build happiness into the work setting? And secondly, back in Bhutan, what is the work like in general, if you can make generalizations, and are women included in the workforce? And my final question is, are you Dutch?
My background is, yes, but I really, I spend more time actually extolling the virtues of the Scandinavian countries, but this thing about kids does stand out, and it sort of makes me proud of Dutch heritage that this is in fact the case. I travel to the Netherlands a lot, so I'm very excited about what the Netherlands does in terms of work time and the effect on families. I think the Dutch do a lot of things wrong too. I think the Scandinavian countries do more things right overall than the Netherlands does, but where it comes to family time and kids, they've got it down, and we've got a lot to learn from them. The other questions were work in Bhutan. Bhutan does not measure work satisfaction. We got this from Gallup because it's much more important here, where people tend to work in large organizations, factories, offices, and so forth. Most people in Bhutan are either small independent business people, or they are small farmers and peasants. There are not a lot of large companies or institutions in Bhutan, so Bhutan actually doesn't measure this. Work satisfaction in Bhutan probably isn't that different from one person to the next. I think they are interested in things they can do to make the work setting better, but I do believe other countries are more interested in these kinds of things. How can you make work a more enjoyable experience, because it does have so much impact. And smart employers are learning that there are a number of things you can do. You don't overwork people. You try to compensate people as much as possible for the work that they do. You give them adequate benefits. You try to flatten the hierarchy so people have as much autonomy and control as possible. One thing we know is that the folks who get heart attacks in companies are not just the people who work the longest hours. The CEOs often work the longest hours. They're not the people who get the heart attacks. Lower level managers who have both long work hours and lack of control are the ones who suffer in terms of both health and happiness. So trying to give people more autonomy and control, not having a boss who is, lords it over you and is crabby and all those kind of things. All that matters. And there's a lot of research about it. Happiness in the workplace. There's a very good now group, listserv on happiness in the workplace. Interestingly enough, most of the people participating in it are in the Nordic countries and in the Netherlands, but there's some interesting stuff there. And and the third,
Women.
women in Bhutan. Okay. Bhutan is still, I would say, in many ways, a pretty patriarchal country. Now, it's not that women in Bhutan are independent-minded. They speak up, they're not shy. Relations between the genders seem to be quite egalitarian. Where this breaks down is when it comes to institutional leadership. Bhutan is just very heavily male when it comes to the parliament, when it comes to the people who have up to now had the chance to go on for higher education, although many, many more young women are doing that from Bhutan. So I think that's starting to change. I certainly did not find, well, women are not wallflowers in Bhutan. They speak up for themselves, and they expect to do that. And so I think it's changing in a positive direction, but you don't yet see that in the leadership of the country. Is that a fair answer? Anybody else?
Do you
Yes.
just have one more, real quick one?
Yeah, okay, last one.
Okay, fast. You mentioned television
Yes.
twice. One, 1999, when it was introduced in Bhutan, and then also like when people spend their time watching television, it doesn't make them happier. Could you just say a little bit more about any links between television watching and happiness?
Between television watching and happiness. Yeah, there's Gallup and other organizations do a fair amount of polling about how satisfied people feel with different activities during the day. Anybody want to guess what the least happy time of day, least happy activity for Americans is? Pardon?
Waking up.
My hearing is not good enough.
Oh, I said waking up.
Waking up. Oh, jeez. It's not that bad yet. But it's the morning commute, so you're close. The next unhappy time, the second most unhappy time for Americans, according to the studies, is being at work. And the third most unhappy time is commuting home. But at least in that case, you're going home. What is the happiest time for people? Socializing after work, socializing at work. Intimate relations is number one, you might suspect that, but time spent with family and friends, exercise, things like that. TV viewing is not the worst by a long shot. People certainly prefer it to commuting and to working, but it's not very high. People don't express a lot of satisfaction from TV viewing. They express far more satisfaction from getting out and doing things with other people. So if you get a steady diet of TV, and the other thing a steady diet of TV does is it creates two thoughts for you. One of them is, it's full of advertising. So it's telling you that you need all this stuff, more and more and more. I mean, that's really what TV is for. It's to sell eyeballs to advertisers. That's how it works. And the second thing it does is it is very, very heavily filled with things that are not very common in life as it is. People are always killing each other and doing things like that on television. And so people who, for instance, watch steady diet of TV have much higher notion of how much crime exists, a much greater sense that the world around them is a dangerous place, much lower levels of trust, which is a huge factor in happiness. One of the things we ask a lot, and Gallup asks questions about is, do you trust your neighbors? Do you trust your, people around you? Do you trust people at work and so forth? People who watch a lot of television trust less. So these are negative effects in addition to the way they assess the pleasure of watching TV itself. And so we can see that if you do a lot of this, it has that effect. And in Bhutan, we could actually see that violent television directly contributed to not people killing each other. That doesn't happen a lot in Bhutan. Murder rate's very low. But to spousal abuse and people beating people or getting into fights, not with fists and stuff, not with guns, because they don't really have guns in the hands of a lot of people there. So TV does have a big effect. Okay, we're gonna break the rules.
Did
One more.
Bhutan's TV programming, did it mirror the development, I'm like in the 50s, you know, a violent show was Ozzy having an argument with Harriet, or Ozzy, you know, and now it's NCIS.
No, it didn't. Bhutan went to write what the stuff was in 1999. So it didn't have that. And it maybe if had it had that pattern, you wouldn't have noticed the effect so dramatically. It's because, I think, Bhutan got programming came from India. Indian television is uniformly raunchy. It is violent. It is abusive to women. It's generally crap. I mean, I'm sorry to say that, but I watched a lot of TV just to see what it was like while I was in Bhutan. All TV in Bhutan, almost all TV in Bhutan is in English. Almost the entire population speaks English. It is the language taught in the schools, so it's very easy to communicate with Bhutanese. They watch TV in English, so you can see exactly what they're watching. And it's a lot of stuff glorifying consumerism, glorifying being rich, you know. The same kind of stuff is here, only to be honest with you, and I'm no fan of American TV, but to be honest with you, our TV is considerably better than what they get. So, okay, thank you all for your patience.